reaction was powerful and immediate. At the turn of the 20th century, when the first film fans took their seats in a dark theater, they became mesmerized by the vision of the strong mythological creatures existing on the edges of life and death. The vampires, primal and ancient. After 100 years and 1,000 of vampire films produced in more than 40 languages, the fascination is as strong as ever. If we need further evidence of Hollywood's enormous influence over the popular culture, then we should look at the most recent vampire craze following the release of Twilight films. In 2010, the most popular names in the United States are Jacob and Bella, the names of the two series' main characters. And there is a globally emerging new wave of vampire idealism, inducing many to sharpen their teeth and drink animal blood to imitate vampires. But before the vampire films transferred the old vampire legends from the medieval Carpathian Mountain to the suburban American neighborhoods, there were vampire craze spilling real human blood from the banks of the mystical rivers of Babylonia to the 14th century Black Plague riots killing villages of people who were suspected to bury the undead. But it wasn't until 1897 that Bram Stoker brought us the definitive classic for vampire mythos, symbols, and archetypes. Dracula stands as the basis for the majority of vampire films today. It provides the framework for what a vampire can be. Films either follow the mold or move to uncharted territory. In either event, Dracula exists as the father of modern vampires. While classic literature has laid the basic groundwork for vampire mythology, film is responsible for manipulating it into the phenomenon we currently know. Because of this, we are left with a growing archetype whose lineage can be finely traced through the vampire films created in the wake. We will follow the history of the vampire films leading up to the explosive genesis of the modern media and culture, by now fully occupied by the undead. Dracula, Elizabeth Bathory, Nosferatu, Vlad the Impaler, and Frankenstein. These are the stories for Nightfall. As the medieval centuries were turning in Transylvania, right outside of the burning edges of the Ottoman Empire, there were two related historic figures who were considered to be the true archetypes for all of our vampire stories. One was a prince who was orphaned but lived to revenge the death of his father. The other, a countess, a brilliant child, the smartest and richest of them all. Their story moved from history to folklore, passing into literature and eventually to film, creating the most extraordinary basis for centuries of fear and nightmares. Vlad the Impaler's Russian surname was Dracula, which meant that he was the son of the dragon. In the year of his birth, Vlad's father, also known under the nickname of Dracula, had traveled to Nuremberg in Germany, where he had been vested into the Order of the Dragon. He fought the Ottomans who raised him, the Germans who paid all of his taxes, the Hungarians, the Vatican, his blood brother, and always his own family of boyars throughout Eastern Europe. Vlad was known to establish Bucharest and to manage to keep the rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire from invading Moldavia and Transylvania without the customary financial help from the Pope or the church bankers in Venice. But his real reputation was not that of the savior of Christianity, but rather a symbol of merciless brutality for his unimaginable cruelty during the years of his power. The number of his tortured victims were about 80 to 100,000, an enormous amount for a small regional ruler. Impalement was Vlad's preferred method of torture and execution. Horses were attached to each of the victim's legs as a sharpened stake was gradually forced into the body. Death by impalement was slow and agonizing. Victims sometimes endured for hours or even days. He often had the stakes arranged in various geometric patterns. The height of the spear indicated the rank of the victim. Unlike the fictional Dracula films, there have been comparatively few movies about the man who inspired the vampire. Elizabeth Bathory was born in 1560, and Vlad the Impaler was her great-uncle. A brilliant child who spoke many languages, and from her late teens owned and managed a large Hungarian estate by successfully fighting the Ottoman, producing huge wealth and loaning large sums of money to the always needy Hungarian king. But that money was never to be paid back, as she was nicknamed the Blood Countess, and was jailed for the charge of murder after the death of her powerful husband. The history of Elizabeth Bathory inspired numerous stories during the 18th and 19th centuries. The most common motif of these works was that of the Countess bathing in her victim's blood in order to retain beauty or youth. Elizabeth married Count Nadezhdy when she was only 15 years of age. Her husband soon became the chief commander of Hungarian troops, leading them to war against the Ottomans. It was rumored that he also used his dungeon for the torture of his enemies. After her husband's death, she and 4 servants were accused of torturing and killing hundreds of girls and young women, with one witness attributing to them over 600 victims. Elizabeth herself was neither tried nor convicted. In 1610, however, she was imprisoned in a castle, where she remained bricked in a set of rooms until her death 4 years later. Later writings about the case have led to legendary accounts of the Countess bathing in the blood of virgins in order to retain her youth. Elizabeth has been given the nicknames of Blood Countess and Countess Dracula. Some witnesses named relatives who died. Others reported having seen traces of torture on dead bodies, some of which were buried in graveyards, and others in unmarked locations. In addition to the defendants, several people were named for supplying her with young women. The girls had been procured either by deception or by force. Elizabeth Bathory has continued to appear as a character in music, film, plays, and to serve as an inspiration for similar characters. In 1915, while film was still in its infancy and the truly horrifying dimensions of World War I became clear, a shocking film was released which took the audience from one scary event to another, creating a new narrative for motion pictures. A prolific French director, Louis Frelade, created a masterpiece which soon inspired Alfred Hitchcock and Fritz Lang to invent an entirely new film language, establishing a new visual style, from film noir to German expressionism. This was a brutal thriller, which was the first film that depicted detailed police procedure, which was modern and yet surrealistic, characters ranging from comical to lyrical. Le Vampire is considered to be one of the most accessible silent films at the time. The film's hero is a reporter who is investigating a group of criminals called the Vampires, who are invading Paris. All of the film's fascinating characters enter rooms via chimneys, water wells, or slowly invading their environment as part of their process of seduction and penetration. The Vampires tease the public with their obvious presence. Their silly dance troupe openly advertises Irma Vep on the marquee. Like in all the modern vampire films, this story makes uniquely powerful the use of natural settings. This time, it is the turn of the century Paris which introduced the idea that a film can set violence in the most everyday and respectable looking of surroundings. Evil hits home in bland residential areas and disarming provincial settings. This vampire film was the starting point of a modern thriller and a chilling coming attraction to the 20th century. Unlike the musicals and gangster films, the vampire films did not have to wait for the development of sound. But this film is strongly affected by the circumstances of its production. Fruited had very little time and money to polish his scenarios or even to establish a conventional script. The stories of an intrepid reporter and his comic sidekicks were even more bizarre and outrageous than the exploits committed by a gang of criminals led by a ruthless killer in a master disguise. Many of the scenes were improvised on the streets around the studio. The pressures brought on by the changing cast of players meant that occasionally even the seemingly indestructible villain had to be suddenly and inexplicably killed off. Throughout the years, many good vampire films were shaped by their production constraint. The jaw-dropping French Sodium Babies grew out of a web series to successfully combine 21st century visual styles and relevant social commentary.
Car ce soir, nous allons tous payer pour un crime vieux de plus de 30 ans. On se connaît ?
The earliest cinematic appearance by a vampire was in Robert G. Vignola's 1913 film, The Vampire. However, because of the portrayal of the film's lead vampire as a femme fatale, she is considered to be more human and less vampire. The film was loosely based off a Rudyard Kipling poem and featured the antagonist, a most evil main character, as a seductress and hunter of sorts. Seduction as an archetypal attribute of cinema's modern vampire was fully developed with the 1915 film A Fool There Was. This was the first production of the Hungarian-born William Fox, the founder of 20th Century Fox. Once again inspired by a Kipling poem, the film took an entirely different direction. A Fool There Was also a watershed in early film publicity. At a press conference, the studio gave an elaborate fictional biography of Theda Bara, making her an exotic Arabian actress. Then they made an intentional leak to the press that the whole thing was a hoax. This may have been one of Hollywood's first publicity stunts. The mild symbolism of these films eventually gave way to the violent hyper-reality as a dominant language for horror films. Symbolic narrative style turned into dark, highly disturbing, violent, but frequently ironic visions. Here, nothing is left for the imagination. Fear is not what is anticipated, but sheer terror and mind-blowing brutality. All of this generating current box office success and criticism. The 1932 film Carl Dreyer's The Vampire is one of the greatest horror films of all time. Its storyline is secondary to its visual power. The plot involves a man who finds himself embroiled in a mystery with a female vampire and the strange characters that surround her in the Gothic castle where they live. The famous shot of the hero looking at himself in a coffin was used again by Bergman for the early dream sequence in the 1957 Wild Strawberries. One of the most impressive scenes involves a funeral procession from the perspective of the corpse. Through a window in the coffin, we see the faces that peer in and the passing scenery above as the casket is taken away. Over 649 films in addition to more than 1,000 books, along with cartoons, comics, and television programs, took inspiration from a single work of vampire literature published in 1897. Dracula has been attributed to many literary genres, including vampire literature, horror fiction, the Gothic novel, and invasion literature. But most importantly, it is an epistolary novel that is told as a series of letters, diary entries, ship's logs, and the like. Literary critics have examined many themes in the novel, such as the role of women in Victorian culture, conventional and conservative sexuality, immigration, colonialism, and folklore. Almost destroyed by Stoker's widow because of copyright infringement, the film was banned, censored, smuggled, celebrated, and readapted numerous times. The making of Murnau's 1922 Nosferatu has passed into legend. One of the most screened silent films of all time, this unauthorized adaptation is perhaps the most frightening and authentic portrayal of the Bram Stoker novel. The only other film adaptation that comes close is Werner Herzog's 1979 remake starring Klaus Kinski. Herzog considered Murnau's Nosferatu to be the greatest film ever to come out of Germany. In 1979, the time that the copyright for Dracula had entered public domain, Herzog proceeded with his updated version of the classic German film, which could now include the original character names. The 1922 Nosferatu was the first and last that Piranha Film produced. The company declared bankruptcy after Bram Stoker's estate sued for copyright infringement and won. With the influence of producer and production designer Albin Grau, the film established one of two main depictions of film vampires. The Nosferatu type is a living corpse with rodent features, especially elongated fingernails and incisors, associated with rats and plague, and is neither charming nor erotic, but rather totally repugnant. The victims usually die and are not turned into vampires themselves. A more universal effect of the film is less obvious. The ending of Nosferatu single-handedly created the concept that vampires can be physically harmed by sunlight. Since Nosferatu's release, the vampire legends have quickly incorporated the idea of fearing or being destroyed by the sun. The basic elements of Stoker's novel remain the core of most of the vampire films, but the creative and surprising variations of its theme are also obvious. A wide variety of vampire tales from the 60s were made with more overtly sexual overtones and violence. But what if Bram Stoker existed today? Some believe that he would offer the novel to readers in a blog format. Well-known blogger Whitney Sorrow has undertaken a new project to present the events of Dracula in a blog format, so readers can experience the original novel unfolding in real time.
Look, to be honest, I think that vampire films have to be silent. There is no sound for the true horror. Before I went to medical school, I used to work in a hospital downtown. It was a cheerful and colorful place during the day, but during the night was when many of the patients had their final moments of fear in total silence. I bring back their voices in my silent films.
When the silent era ended and Dracula started to speak, he had quite an eerie speech pattern.
Let no one leave. Move only at your peril. We will not stop until we have discovered the vampires who seek the life of this beautiful girl and her lover. Watch out! They may be hovering over you, or you, or you!
While the introduction of sound led to a boom in the motion picture industry, it had an adverse effect on the career of the Hollywood actors of the time. Suddenly, those without stage experience were regarded as suspect by the studios, and those whose heavy accents or otherwise discordant voices had been previously concealed were particularly at risk. One of the first major stars of the talkies had an unusual background and language skills from the get-go.
Send me word when you use it.
In 1920, on a merchant ship, an illegal immigrant who pretended to be a sailor entered the United States at the port of New Orleans. He was not an ordinary refugee. The European silent film star was on the run from Budapest and Berlin for his support of the First Actors Union during the 1919 Revolution. After he made his way to New York, he was legally inspected for immigration at Ellis Island. The Transylvania-born Hungarian actor named Bela Lugosi soon landed a role in a silent film, and after studying English in the summer of 1927, was offered the role of Dracula in a Broadway production. The play was a huge success, running 261 performances before touring all around the United States. His accent, his voice, and his light European persona fit the role just perfectly.
Vampire films are about family. The first time I watched Dracula was with my sister. I was shaking all night, not for the fear, but for the thought that my distant Hungarian grandfather had to be Dracula's love child. I was 7 at the time. Dad was staying home all day listening to the radio, and then at night, he went out, saying he was going to the opera. When I looked at his wrinkled face, it was clear. We share a secret.
1931 brought horror fans the second archetypical envisioning of the vampire.
I am Dracula.
Casting Bela Lugosi in the lead, Dracula, this time with the permission from the Stoker estate, brought us the refined, sophisticated vampire we know today. This archetype, much like Stoker's original, used seduction as a means to harvest humans for food. However, unlike Orlok, Dracula would let his prey live, bringing them back to life as vampires. This stands as a parallel to Nosferatu in terms of how the vampire views the rest of humanity.
The American vampire films, without a question, it's Universal. Universal is a studio that staked everything it had on horror. The 30s were dominated by gangster films and musicals, but the other thing that were dominated were by horror films. And no other studio attacked it with the same kind of zeal and vigor that Universal did, starting with Frankenstein in 1931 and then Dracula. Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi, directed by Todd Browning. They shot the thing on these huge, enormous sets during the day, and at night they would reuse the same sets for the Spanish version.
As his career moved on, Lugosi became a camp caricature, but in this film he's shockingly scary.
This is no dream. This is Dracula, the original terrifying story of a maniac.
Lugosi's was an elegant portrayal of Dracula, which contrasted Shrek's version so greatly that the two films will always contest each other for the top spot in vampire cinema.
Dracula
To many film lovers and critics alike, Lugosi's portrayal is widely regarded as the definitive Dracula.
Extended his arm, and he made me drink.
He had a powerful presence and authority on screen. The slow, deliberate pacing of his performance gave Dracula the air of a walking, talking corpse, which terrified 1931 movie audiences. He was just as compelling with no dialogue, and the many close-ups of Lugosi's face in icy silence jumped off the screen. With this mesmerizing performance, Dracula became Bela Lugosi's signature role. Dracula had such great success that Universal Studios sparked two sequels, Dracula's Daughter in 1936 and Son of Dracula in 1943.
Unseen among its enemies.
Son of Dracula, searing the screen with new terror.
Columbia Pictures produced The Return of the Vampire in 1944, and there were 4 other vampire-related films prior to 1950. The most popular being Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which featured Lugosi's last portrayal of Dracula and was the first of many absurd vampire-themed comedies.
Come on, take it all out.
Wow! Look out, Chip! Cover up! Cover up! Wait a minute!
Scared to Death was completed several years before its 1947 release, and it is historically important as Bela Lugosi's surviving color film.
Yes, sir.
Sir, there is an air of inquiry about you that immediately offends my deepest nature. There is something suggesting Scotland Yard, the French Sûreté, the Italian Carabinieri, the Turkish Polizei, and other minions of the law. In short, sir, I think you're a cop. Yeah. Do not be polite to Inigo.
After he achieved movie stardom in Dracula, neither he nor Hollywood knew how to exploit his success or to capitalize properly on his image. As the vampire films were just about to disappear from the cinemas, a brilliant Mexican film rewrote the rules and eventually led the way to a new style of vampire cinema. Fernando Mendez's 1957 adaptation, El Vampiro, a reintroduced hypnotic nature of vampire cinema, was placed in a new light. The film, about a young girl who returns to her native town only to find her family dead and the townspeople under the trance of a vampire, accomplishes a lot in terms of furthering vampire horror cinema. To begin with, this was the first film to introduce the devilish trick of vampires spelling their names backwards in order to live among the public. Essentially, Count Carol de la Vood, the vampire, is known as Mr. Duval to the townspeople. Another archetype developed in this film was the cinematic use of the vampire's fangs. In previous films, the vampire's teeth were either hidden, like in the case of Bela Lugosi, or in the case of Nosferatu, the incisors were shown instead. However, while these two characteristics were huge additions to vampire cinema, it was the connection between Universal Studios' monster movies and Hammer Productions that makes El Vampiro so important. William Hines, a London jeweler, comedian, and cycling enthusiast, finally registered his own film company, Hammer Film, in 1934. The slump in the British film industry forced him into liquidation within a year. Somehow the company survived, But they had to wait more than 2 decades to find a breakthrough success with the birth of a new style of horror films known as the Hammer horror. Dracula was reincarnated for a new generation in the celebrated Hammer horror series of films starring Christopher Lee as the Count.
To inflict his terror upon the
Hammer Productions had been around making monster and science fiction films since the 30s, but it was their heralded reincarnation of Frankenstein that led to the rebirth of monster films and the next incarnation of Dracula. However, reproducing and distributing Dracula proved to be a tedious task. Because of ongoing legal battles between Hammer and Universal Studios, Dracula remained unreleased until 1958, after it had been finished shooting for over a year. The role of Dracula made Christopher Lee a star, and Peter Cushing made an indelible mark as Van Helsing. Hammer Horror reinvigorated the Dracula novel in an extensive collection of provocative low-budget films by using sensual colors, constant flowing of blood, and a more overtly gory violence. Beginning with Dracula and ending with the 1974 film called The Satanic Rites of Dracula, Hammer created a stylish, rapidly paced interpretation of Bram Stoker's novel, which was going behind the surface of Victorian society, using Dracula as a metaphor for the release of sexual urges which had long been repressed.
Messengers of death. 4 horsemen of my created apocalypse. 4 carriers of the plague who will infect their miserable.
Lee's Dracula is a radical departure from the role, as interpreted by Bela Lugosi. For the first time, Dracula is seen as a figure of sexual magnetism rather than a rapacious animal savoring for blood alone. Dracula is an aristocrat first who hides his rupture with society beneath precisely clipped speech and elegant manners. It is only the night which liberates Dracula's other personality.
Listen to the beat of your heart, Marianne. You hear
in the 1960 Brides of Dracula, a young teacher on her way to a position in Transylvania helps a young man escape the shackles his mother has put on him. In doing so, she innocently unleashes the horrors of the undead. A highly provocative and disturbing addition to the Hammer vampire films takes place in a village in 19th century Austria, where scared townspeople were first delighted when a circus breaks through the quarantine to take the local minds off the plague. But their real troubles began when children disappeared, and the horrific legacy of a long-ago massacre is brought to light in the vampire circus. Looking back to these movies, it is now clear that Hammer vampire films, particularly those directed by Terence Fisher, were simply ahead of their time. And to the degree of graphic violence which pervades the horror films, it was simply a response to the needs of the viewing audience for greater realism. These films stand as one of the signal achievements of the British cinema and paved the way for the next cycle of horror films. Though the battle may be vigorous and hazardous in these films, good being infinite will inevitably triumph over the evil of Dracula and his minions. Some see this as a structural weakness for Hammer's vision. If so, it is a weakness shared by Britain's 2 greatest Gothic writers, Mary Shelley and Bram Stoker. Taste the Blood of Dracula was produced before the Hammer Dracula franchise collapsed as the last significant entry, which found Christopher Lee as the Count, who returns to life after 3 middle-aged swingers decide to abuse his private black magic to bolster their non-existent sex lives. As the 70s were approaching, the inventive Hammer studio started to face a more meaningful competition from the Hollywood studios and the American master filmmakers. The new generation of filmmakers were transferring the B films from the small independent producers to mega-budget global events. For a while, the Hammer films were still popular, but much less influential than those produced at the beginning of their cycle. For the vampire horror enthusiast, the Orient was always their favorite destination. The perception of ancient secrets and mysticism, coupled with forcefulness, the instant use of power and violence, made it an excellent cultural premise for vampire films. In 1974, at the height of the popularity of both the Kung Fu and the Dracula films, a new martial arts mixed vampire film was produced. It was The Legend of the Seven Gold Vampires, the last Dracula film co-produced by Hammer Films. Professor Lawrence Van Helsing, played by Peter Cushing, gives a lecture in 1904 at a Chinese university on a Chinese vampire legend. He speaks of an unknown rural village that has been terrorized by vampires for many years. After the lecture, a student informs him that the legend is true and that he knows the location of the village. He then asks Professor Van Helsing if he would be willing to travel to the village and destroy the vampire menace. Van Helsing agrees and embarks with his son, one of his students, and his 6 kung fu trained siblings on a dangerous journey funded by a wealthy widow. The 7 golden vampires, however, are acting under the guidance of Count Dracula himself. Gothism gave birth to some of the most important elements of vampire literature and eventually influenced the development of horror films.
Well, Gothic horror movies really take place in England, and most of the best Gothic horror movies are British. And that's because the Frankenstein mythos, of course, from Mary Shelley's 1816 novel, and Dracula from Bram Stoker's novel are both British novels.
The same literary movement also impacted another and distantly related genre known as science fiction. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is often cited as a crucial influence to sci-fi films. The novel is of particular interest because of its portrayal creating life from non-living materials and because of Shelley's investigation of the ethical ramifications of the human creation of life. Later science fiction narratives about robots, cyborgs, artificial intelligence, and cloning clearly owe a debt to Shelley, though few, if any, authors have surpassed her intense exploration of the sublime natural world. From the start, horror and science fiction were related. Early horror movies are largely based on classic literature of Gothic horror genre, such as Dracula, Frankenstein, The Phantom of the Opera, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but some others draw inspiration from the imagination rooted in science. The 1940 Devil Bat was both a horror film and science fiction movie. The story involves a small-town cosmetic company chemist who is upset at his wealthy employers because he feels they have denied him his due share of company success. To get revenge, he breeds giant bats, He then conditions them to kill those wearing a special aftershave lotion that he has concocted.
Now rub it on the tender part of your neck. Yeah.
He cleverly distributes the lotion to his enemies as a test product. Once they have applied the lotion, the chemist releases his devil bats in the night, which kill his 2 former partners and 3 members of their families. A hotshot big city reporter gets assigned by his editor to cover and help solve the murders. The mad chemist is predictably done in by his own shaving lotion and by his own creation, the dreaded devil bat. Years after the release of The Planet of the Vampires, some critics suggested that the film's narrative details and visual design appeared to have been a major influence on Ridley Scott's Alien. The Mario Bava-directed US-Italian film barely had a $100,000 budget with a complicated story that follows the horrific experiences of the crew members of 2 giant spaceships that have crash-landed on a forbidding, unexplored planet. The disembodied inhabitants of that world possess the bodies of the crew who died during the crash, and use the animated corpses to stalk and kill the remaining survivors.
Yeah, I own the world. An empty, dead, silent world.
An earlier Italian film, The Last Man on Earth, was the source material for another American horror classic.
More of them for the pit. Every day there are more of them. They live off the weak ones and leave them for the pit.
George A. Romero has acknowledged that the source material of The Last Man on Earth was an important influence on his film The Night of the Living Dead, remarking that he basically ripped it off from a Richard Matheson novel called I Am Legend. The book was adapted many more times for motion pictures, including the recent box office hit I Am Legend starring Will Smith.
Very rarely in my life.
Numerous critics have suggested that the Last Man on Earth film itself was also a source of inspiration for The Night of the Living Dead.
Yesterday, Madison Street.
The year is 1968, and every day is the same for Dr. Robert Morgan. He wakes up, gathers his weapons, and then goes hunting for vampires.
Just wide enough to keep the flesh apart so their body seal can't function. And how many more of these will I have to make before they're all destroyed?
Morgan lives in a world where everyone else has been infected by a plague that turns them into undead vampiric creatures. They cannot stand sunlight, they fear mirrors, and are repelled by garlic. They would kill Morgan if they could, but fortunately they are weak and not very smart. At night, Morgan locks himself inside his house. During the day, he kills as many vampires as he can. For the atomic brain, the old Elizabeth Bathory vampire legend is used as a basis for the storyline. An elderly woman uses her vast fortune to convince an eccentric yet brilliant scientist to transplant her brain into a new youthful body. The bodies are provided by 3 immigrant young women who are hired to be servants. The old woman then chooses which of the girls she finds most beautiful and sets about replacing the young woman's brain with her own.
He has grafted a living animal's brain into this newly dead.
In the Omega Man, biological warfare between the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union kills most of the world's human population. The U.S. Army and a military scientist based in Los Angeles begin to succumb to the plague, but vaccinates himself with an experimental and yet-to-be-tested vaccine, just in time, rendering himself immune. The plague's surviving victims, meanwhile, join together as the Family, a cult of nocturnal homicidal mutants with plague-induced albinism who seek to destroy the last vestiges of technological society. Director Tim Burton claims Omega Man to be one of his favorite films. The late 60s proved to be fruitful for vampire cinema, but the early 70s, it had hit a slump. While studios were still trying to push films like 1971's Dracula vs. Frankenstein, it was the cultural movement of change that influenced the films the most. Blackula and the subsequent sequel, Scream, Blackula, Scream, illustrate the power of racial divide. In 1780, Prince Mamawald, the ruler of an African nation, seeks the help of Count Dracula in suppressing the slave trade.
You know, he is a strange dude.
The film spurned a series of horror-related blaxploitation films like Blackenstein. The story is about Eddie Turner, who stepped on a landmine in Vietnam and lost all of his limbs. His fiancée, Dr. Winifred Walker, thinks she's found help for him in her former teacher and colleague, Dr. Stein, who has recently won a Nobel Peace Prize for solving the DNA genetic code. In a tour of Dr. Stein's home laboratory, Dr. Walker is introduced to one of his patients, a 90-year-old woman with the appearance of a 50-year-old, and a Frenchman whose lower legs have been successfully reattached with the help of Dr. Stein's DNA solution. Eddie undergoes a successful surgery, but the doctor's jealous assistant sabotages his treatment and turns him into a monster. Eddie becomes a moaning, shambling monster reminiscent of Boris Karloff's Frankenstein. He is compelled to leave the house to kill, though he returns in time for his ongoing schedule of DNA solution. Many critics list Blackenstein as the worst blaxploitation film ever, for all of the script inconsistencies, production errors, and acting gaffes. But others believe that all the errors were intentional, and the filmmakers intended to have fun with the audience. Sugar Hill is centered on a voodoo queen's using zombies to take revenge on a group of white gangsters. The zombies in this film more closely resemble the creatures of voodoo legend than the flesh-eating living dead ghouls currently so popular. The 70s continued to throw wrenches at vampire films and increased the inert sexuality with Count Yorga, Vampire.
Enjoyed your little joke last night, Doctor. But as you can see, tonight is mine.
Walnut.
Mel Brooks once remarked, "Tragedy is when I cut my finger. Comedy is when you fall into an open sewer and die." There is more comedy than drama at the vampire movies. The idea of turning a serious horror movie into a comedic romp had been around a while, starting in 1948 with Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. The Gothic idea of vampires was spun into something of comedic genius. However, it was in 1967, as Hammer vampire films were fading out, that Roman Polanski released his cult favorite, The Fearless Vampire Killers. Now, Polanski himself is an icon in cinema history, but his vampire film is more of a conundrum. The viewer is bombarded with familiar archetypes and a fantastic score. What this film adds to the genre are comedic undertones, sarcasm, and irony.
Dearly beloved brothers and sisters, I thank you for your warm reception. The shorter my speech, the longer our celebration. our motto, death to the living. Joy of living to the dead. I wish you now an increased blood count.
Legendary horror director and Oscar-winning cinematographer Freddie Francis directed Vampire Happening, a film attempting to be the European version of Polanski's Fearless Vampire Killers. Unlike Polanski's film, The Vampire Happening has a severely anti-clerical stance and some extremely unsubtle humor, along with the hallucinatory sex imagery.
So glad to have the opportunity to be alone with you. But some things come up.
It's a hell of a lot better than blood sucking.
Rosemary's baby's blood. A large one.
An even less ambitious but maybe funnier version was Dracula, the Dirty Old Man.
I got to go to the bedroom. I got to get the new here decorated. Boy. Oh, well, what we got? Outdoor fireplace inside.
Oh, got another one, yeah. Oh, you're vampires, huh?
The disco generation rightfully posed the question, whatever happened to Count Dracula? In a variation of the Faust theme, Dracula has become the owner of a prominent Hollywood discotheque, Dracula's Castle, where he hosts wild, drug-filled parties, offering stardom in exchange for a little time with the old bloodsucker. Originally entitled Vampira, there was an English film comedy renamed as Old Dracula.
No more blood, sir? Hey, we must have drunk 3 village girls already.
If you loved young
Count Dracula, played by David Niven, is an old vampire who, because of advanced age, is forced to host tours of his castle to get new victims.
Say something for the kiddies, Drac Bait. Old Dracula, rated PG.
Hi there, folks. This is Alan Sherman, telling you about a movie that I just wrote the title song for. The movie's called My Son the Vampire. Every boy should have a vampire of his own. I'll tell you how I got mine. She just dropped over one night for a bite, so I bit her.
Decades before, in My Son the Vampire, Bela Lugosi played a criminal who thinks he is a vampire, sleeps in a coffin, has a robot, and a machine that can destroy 200 battleships. Lugosi once said, "When a film company is in the red, they always come to me." The vampire lust was always a part of the appeal. Sensuality, erotic thrill, seduction, and surrender to the vampire, rather than brutality of horror. "25 years before Bram Stoker's Dracula was published, another Gothic novella was written by Joseph Chardin Lefanu. This book told the story of a young woman's openness to the curious attentions of a female vampire named Carmilla. A distinct subgenre of vampire films inspired by Camilla explored the topic of lesbian vampires. The first of these was Blood and Roses by Roger Vadim. Carmilla, the title character of the book, is the original prototype for a legion of female lesbian vampires. Although the book portrays vampire sexuality with the circumspection that one would expect for his time, it is evident that lesbian attraction is the main dynamic between Carmilla and the narrator of the story.
A girl whose secret is reflected in an image too dreadful for the eye.
More explicit lesbian content was provided in Hammer Studios' Karnstein trilogy. The first of these, The Vampire Lovers, starring Ingrid Pitt and Madeline Smith, was a relatively straightforward retelling of Defagnu's novella, but with more overt violence and sexuality.
Corridors of terror.
Later films in this subgenre, such as Vampires, became even more explicit in their depiction of sex, nudity, and violence.
Ravishers who tempt men's appetites and feed their own. Vampires thirsting for blood. Their lips are moist and very, very red. They'll rivet you with terror.
If Count Dracula and The Awful Dr. Orloff are just Franco's most recognizable mainstream titles, then The Vampiros Lesbos is his ultimate cult film. The Vampiros Lesbos is an erotic horror tale about a vixen vampire seducing and killing women to appease her insatiable thirst for female blood. Linda is a young American lawyer working in a law office in Turkey. During the night, she has passionate dreams in which a sexy brunette harasses and makes love to her, from which she is unable to defend herself. A minor case about an inheritance forces her to travel to one of the small islands off the Turkish coast. Then her nightmares became a reality with an unexpected outcome. Rediscovered by a new legion of devoted fans, including Quentin Tarantino, who used part of the film's unique music score in his 1998 Jackie Brown, the film launched a new interest in Franco cinema. In some respects, its reputation has become overinflated in the interim, but there's no denying the film's off-kilter appeal. Not surprisingly, vampire films and horror films kept attracting some of the greatest directors, producers, and actors of all times.
Films at that time that really excited me were films that had death incarnate, because they really got right into right into my genetic makeup. Something like Frankenstein or Dracula, the films that have death walking upright and death itself after you, were films that impressed me and frightened me, more so than giant eyeballs from outer space.
You must leave Romania and travel.
Blood for Dracula is a somewhat tamer but still raw companion piece to Paul Morrissey's Flesh for Frankenstein, in which Andy Warhol does nothing but lend his name to both films.
It must be tonight. The girls are beautiful. They look so pure.
Is she? She is. You must come with us to the Count.
It can be said that a vampire love scene is where the vampire lets the other person live. But romanticism requires something much more, like showing the all-powerful and immortal super being bored with his omnipotence and immortality, lamenting on the heavy burden of being him. A traditional romantic hero is a gifted, perhaps misunderstood loner, creatively following the dictates of his inspiration rather than the standards of contemporary society. The ambitious, aggressively individualistic hero was born out of Lord Byron's 18th century writings. He is fully alive and flourishing in the latter half of the 20th century. We can see him again and again on television screens and in movies. Unquestionably, the most popular vampire films are not traditional horror movies. They might have horror elements, but they are the last vestiges of the 18th century Romanticism, which validated strong emotion as the aesthetic experience, placing new emphasis on trepidation, horror, terror, and awe. A vampire with a soul broods over the guilt of crimes of his past and longs for the unattainable love of his life. In addition to the elusive love, the primary factors that resonate with both 19th century and late 20th century audiences are a voyeuristic interest in the criminal and a conviction of the individual powerlessness in the face of wealth and institutional power. This feeling was echoed through culture and society from the 80s as vampire films took a step to identify with the lost souls of vampires. In the spirit of the classical Gothic, these affairs of the heart between the living and the dead are some of the most memorable film experiences.
Where we are now is in a very interesting period in film history entirely. Digital special effects, which kicked in 2000, have made it possible to do practically anything on the screen. So it was a big deal in 1943 when in Son of Dracula, for the first time, we saw in front of our eyes Dracula convincingly transform himself into a bat. All right. Now such a thing is absolutely simple. It's just, a matter of CGI. That's all there is to it. So I think we're in an interesting place right now in vampire films where we are trying to find out a new direction, because I think we're coming to the end of the current cycle. We've had Buffy the Vampire Slayer, we've had the Twilight films, and we've had a whole series of John Carpenter's Vampires, which just came out a few years ago, about a group of vigilantes who hunt vampires down and kill them. But I think we're coming to the end of this cycle. And the question, of course, is with horror movies in general, is horror movies have to horrify. And the Twilight films aren't really horror movies so much as they're teen romances with a vampiric element. But when you have television series even, like The Gates, which is a new television series on ABC, which is about a group of vampires in a gated community, it's getting to the point where it's almost spilling over into parody. The new vampire craze is attributable almost entirely to Anne Rice, Interview with the Vampire. Her books basically took the vampire film and just made it absolutely profitable and popular again. Vampire films also offer a fantasy life, an alternative fantasy life for today's teens, in the same way that, believe it or not, the beach party pictures did in the 1960s, offering people an Edenic vision of endless sand, sun, and surf. You'll be in California, you can surf all day and party all night. Well, now basically you can be a vampire all night and party all day, and it makes these films relevant to teens because the characters are all teens, and also the link between vampirism and sexuality has never been more pronounced.
For 100 years, we were watching the vampires spilling blood on the edges of eternity. They can be elegant and evil, even comical and erotic, a constantly changing metaphor for the outsider, the predator, the freakish. Out of step, but also deeply normal. For millions of people, they are the ever-present companions for the Nightfall.
the sting of her